Hey everybody, it's Sean here with some instructions on how to complete your final project, your formal research proposal. So this project should be done individually and it's worth about 25% of your mark. Well, not about 25%, exactly 25%. It should be 8 to 10 pages, double spaced, and it's due July 20th, which probably feels very soon. But remember that you have the advantage of working off of your previous three assignments that this builds on: your presentation, your reflection on ethical considerations, and your literature review. And that literature review is really going to be the bulk of the content in this proposal. Um, your paper should have the following structure and components. So it needs to have an introduction, which is the explanation of the community research goal or need that's being addressed, um, background information on your research topic, and your now fully defined research questions that should have been refined based on the feedback that we provided to your presentations. And just a reminder, if anyone is still confused on this, research questions are not the same as interview questions. You do not list the interview questions in your introduction. The second step is the literature review. By now you've all submitted, and this week you'll be receiving your feedback from your literature review assignments. And make sure that you use that feedback and integrate it into your assignment so that you can improve your overall mark for this assignment. Um, Again, it's very common in the literature reviews that folks will forget to include background information on the theories or the approaches that they'll be using. Remember that if that's something that you forgot to do initially, work it in now. Don't assume that the reader knows about the theory or how it works or how you plan to apply it. Those are all things that you need to express in your literature review. The third section is where things get a bit new. It's the methodology. Here in this section, what you're going to do is identify the techniques that you're going to use to collect your data. So that includes whether or not you're going to use interviews. Is it going to be participant observation? Are you using secondary data? Where are you getting that secondary data? What sources are you drawing from? Is it the census? Is it records that have been kept by some kind of institution? Where is your data coming from? The next thing to consider is a description of your process for analysis. It's not enough to say that we're going to use content analysis. It's not enough to say that you're going to use thematic analysis. Tell us exactly what the steps you are going to take in that analytical process. Um, as we have explained these processes to you, we've broken them down into smaller steps, and we expect you to do the same thing back to us in this research proposal. That helps us understand that you know how that analytical process works. And it's not just because you're students. This is something that's expected of research proposals in academia generally. Those of us who are professors or researchers have to do this as well to demonstrate to our funders or our faculties or our colleagues that we know what we're doing. And it's part of the accountability of the research process. Another component of the methodology is a discussion of how your theoretical framework is going to impact how you collect and analyze your data. Now, an example of this is when we're using participatory action research as a methodology that's informed by theories like critical theory, anti-oppression theory, um, Marxist theories. They're all they all have an influence on the rationale for why participatory action research is organized the way it is and why participants are involved in the analysis process. Um, so even if you're not using participatory action research, you have to explain why it is that or what the theoretical foundations are for why you're choosing that particular method. Now, it doesn't have to be explicit necessarily because it can be implicit if it's really evident why you're using that particular method that you are. Um, and there may be some repetition in your discussion of the theoretical framework from the literature review. But you may also find that there are certain components of that theoretical discussion of the theoretical framework that you want to take out of your literature review that you wrote earlier and move them into the methodology section here. Lastly, the methodology should also address the role of the community or the stakeholders in your research. So, for instance, is there an advisory group? Do participants get to review your research or ensure that they're being represented as they intended? These are all aspects of the methodology that need to be expressed clearly. The fourth is your discussion on ethical considerations. So you can draw from your ethics assignment, but the thing here is this is no longer a reflection. This section of your assignment is really expressing your identification of the risks and benefits of the research to the participants or to the communities, and then how you are going to concretely mitigate or diminish those risks and maximize the benefits for the benefit of participants in the community. And then the last stage is a summary. So this basically, as you can imagine, just summarizes the purpose of your research and what you plan to do. It should identify any expected or hoped for or potential outcome. So if you have a hypothesis that you're testing, it should be clear in the summary, although you should have expressed it in the introduction as well. But a lot of those things that you're expressing in the introduction, you bring them back in the summary. The idea of a summary is that you're tying all of the threads from the major components together. Another thing to bear in mind is that while there are 5 components of this assignment, it doesn't mean there's going to be 5 paragraphs. Chances are there's going to be many, many, many more paragraphs because, as you'll recall from your literature review, that assignment was or should have been multiple paragraphs as well. So you can break these out with different section headings or any other way that you find helps make it clear that helps make clear the distinction between each of these sections. Now finally, your paper should follow APA guidelines. We expressed that initially for your literature review as well, and the same goes for this assignment as well. If you're still not sure about those guidelines, check out the resources that have already been conveyed about where to go to look, where to get information on how to write something in using the APA format, or just send Lauren or I an email and we'll connect you with those resources. Now, attached to this assignment, there's also your rubric. So this tells you everything that you need to know about how you're going to be assessed. Now, rubrics can't always identify every single thing that's unique or it can't predict everything that's going to occur in a paper, but they're general guidelines. Now, A plus is generally reserved for assignments that go above and beyond the call of the assignment. So if you're gunning for that mark, you're going to have to go beyond merely the minimum requirements that are outlined here. But let's look at the A range for our expectations of this assignment. So for instance, it needs to have focused, appropriate research questions and an exceptional communication thereof. It needs to situate the research in its intellectual and social context. So this refers to the theoretical frameworks as well as the social benefit. There should be reasonable coverage of the literature relevant to the target research area and the theoretical frameworks being used. Remember, it's not enough just to name a theoretical framework, you need to cite sources related to it. It should also relate that theoretical framework back to the choice of data collection and analysis techniques. It should identify those data collection techniques that are appropriate for the proposed research. And that question of appropriateness is important here. If you say that your research project is about assessing the personal feelings of a group of people, but then you don't actually interview them, well, that's kind of a problem because how can you really know what the impact on somebody is without actually talking to them? It's not enough just to say you're going to do something, the techniques that you use for getting um, to that data or to that information that you're looking for have to line up with the goal of your research questions. Also, you should discuss the analysis process that's going to be employed. If you just name it, that moves you down the rubric. You cannot get an A without a discussion of that analytical process. It should also provide appropriate means for the community to be involved in the research process. If you don't have any way that the community is engaged in the research process, then you're not really doing community-based research, and then that doesn't really fit the criteria for this class. Next, it should identify the potential ethical issues and offer a realistic plan for addressing any concerns or potential conflicts. Now, this realistic plan is important. If you say that you're going to hire a staff of social workers who are trained in um, with special trauma training, who are going to be present for every single interview, well, that calls into question the realistic um, capacity of you to carry that work out, because where are you getting the money from? Now, research can be funded, of course, and there's ways to access funding for research that could support that kind of um, uh, process, but keep the scale in mind. Um, you don't want to say that you're going to be doing something that's going to cost a ton of money without that really being aligned with the sources that actually exist for funding research. And then finally, the last 3 points are pretty apparent. So you should have proper use of the APA format. You should address any opposing views or hypotheses if it's applicable. Now, you might be dealing with a topic that doesn't have an opposing or contradictory view that's being advanced, or approach that's being advanced by others in the field. Your literature review and our feedback on that literature review will tell you if this is something that you need to address. And then finally, it has to follow a logical order. So you can add sections if you like, but it should at least have what's outlined in the handout, which is this. Now, as you go down, you'll notice these notes in our rubric. Things like automatically max B range if there's evidence of some kind of problematic choice of topic area, failure to identify appropriate literature, or lacks a major section of the research proposal. So if you're missing a section, the maximum you can expect to get, even if absolutely everything else is done perfectly, is a B+. And you can see some of the points that exist in these criteria further down that will bring your mark down. So for instance, if the writing or the concept lacks cohesion, if there's insufficient background information. So don't assume that we know what you're talking about, especially don't assume that just because we've read your literature review or your presentation means that we're taking that stuff for granted. We aren't. That stuff needs to be reiterated in your final proposal. If there's insufficient consideration of one of the ethical issues, or the theoretical framework, or the analysis process, or the community engagement, or if it demonstrates a lack of feedback provided to the instructor. Now, I should clarify here too that you don't. It's not the presence of all of these things that will get you a B. It's the presence of one of these things that will get you a B. If you have all four of these, or three of the four, then you're moving down to a B minus or lower. And you can see the further down you go, the additional criteria that will bring your mark down. So for instance, if you don't actually articulate research questions, rather you're just focused on a research topic, that gets you a C+. If you ignore the citation requirements, so you don't use APA guidelines at all, then that brings you down to this range as well. If you're missing the theoretical framework altogether, that will get you a C. and so on and so forth. So do take a look at the different criteria here. Um, don't worry too much about it though, so long as you're focused on achieving what's set out in this range. Now, this is all a learning process. We can't guarantee A's all around, but remember that you can always reach out to us if you have questions about how to actually enact some of these guidelines. Never hesitate to get in touch with us. Um, and then finally, the last thing we have down at the bottom, this is just a reiteration of the letter grade equivalencies for the with percentages. So an A is in the range of 80 to 100, a B is 70 to 79, etc., etc. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, so that's an overview of your final paper. If you have any questions, again, don't hesitate to be in touch. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you soon.